Good morning. I'm Joanne Allen, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the Unitarian Universalist Church of Brunswick on this Wabanaki land that we now call Brunswick, Maine. If you are visiting and would like more information about our congregation, please stop at the visitors table in the fellowship hall just over here. The folks there will be happy to answer any of your questions. In the interest of safety, please note there are 3 exits to this building. The one you came in, the door you came in, one just over here at the back near the AV booth, and all the way through the back of the building, through the RE area, there's one directly at the back to be safe. I would like to just introduce briefly Grace. Grace Lewis McLaren is going to do your service today. We're really lucky. And Grace joined UUCB in the 1970s, so she's been a longtime member. She was director of music here for several years. Grace is a musician, a mythologist, an auntie, and a mother. 19, and a friend, a good friend, yeah. 1986 to 2001, Grace was on the administrative staff of First UU Church in San Diego. Today, she is going to be talking about love. We begin the service today. As we begin, please silence your cell phones and your mobile devices. Once again, welcome. We're glad you're here.
Our reading for chalice lighting is by Bell Hooks. Knowing how to be solitary is central to the art of loving. When we can be alone, we can be with others without using them as a means of escape. I'm Sienna Dode. I'm Grace's worship associate for today, and I'm happy to do the first reading by E.E. Cummings, entitled Maggie and Millie and Molly and May. Maggie and Millie and Molly and May went down to the beach to play one day, and Maggie discovered a shell that sang so sweetly she couldn't remember her troubles. And Millie befriended a stranded star whose rays 5 languid fingers were. And Molly was chased by a horrible thing which raced sideways while blowing bubbles. And May came home with a smooth round stone, as small as a world and as large as a lone. For whatever we lose, like a you or a me, it's always ourselves we find in the sea. So good morning, and thank you for being here. First off, I want to thank Irene Austin and Mary Larson for the double flowers in front of us. Thank you. And I instructed the ushers to make sure that everybody had one of these.
This hymnal is now 30 years old. 30 years old. I was on the resource committee for this when it was being put together by the UUA, and they would send me a text or a tune or something and say, could you do an arrangement of this or a harmonization, or we need different words for this. So it was that kind of thing where you just never knew what you were going to get, and you'd send something back, and some of it went in the trash barrel, and some of it got accepted. But this hymnal is now 30 years old, and I have trouble, of course, I have trouble believing how old I am, too. So I'm going to ask you to turn to number 66, which is a hymn that you don't get to choose very often because it's a summertime hymn. So I'm going to ask Nell to play the whole tune for us, and then when she's done playing the whole tune, I will ask you to stand, if you're willing and able, and sing it. I'm Mary Larson, the Pastoral Care Associate. For joys, there are none written, but I have great joys for all the blooms and the flowers everywhere, and hope you do too, even though my cosmos are taller than me. I think they were searching for the sun. Concerns. George Parento, this is from Paul Parento. George Parento, my 87-year-old brother, died August 11th after some years of declining health in Madison, Wisconsin. George was a humanist, college professor, traveler, writer of endless letters, and a spiritual and emotional guide for me, serving as de facto father and older brother for most of our lives. Lee and I were able to be with him in the days prior to his death, saying those things to each other that needed to be said, which was a comfort. From Sienna Dode. I am saddened by the terrible devastation to Lahaina in Maui, one of my favorite cities, and for its history, beauty, charm, and shopping opportunities. We all have concerns, I hope, about the fires that are devastating internationally. especially in Canada right now. Deep concerns for the storm about to hit the Southwest, especially loved ones in San Diego, Grace's family, and our former interim minister, Justine Sullivan, and her wife, Dale. If you are not attending in-person services and would like a joy or concern read from the pulpit, you may send an email to uucbjoysandconcerns@gmail.com. This address is up on the screen and in UUCB's weekly email. If you have a concern you would like to discuss in private, please speak to a pastoral care associate. We have light blue ribbons on our name tags and would be happy to listen and help.
I would ask that we all hold a few moments of silent thinking about what's happening to our planet, particularly, and to each of us and families as individuals. I'm thinking particularly of Paul and Lee Parento, and what a blessing it is to be with somebody who is dying. That really is an opportunity, a blessing that one does not get to repeat or sometimes even think about. You just have to be there, and it's tough. And important, really important. And then what's happening to our planet? I too have been to Lahaina a couple times and just have friends that I don't know whether they survived, and they may not have, and we won't even know for a long time. And then the people in Canada who have had to leave their homes. And some of them probably had to leave pets behind. I just can't imagine the grief. And these are things that we have to acknowledge in this community, because these are the things that we think about. I have a reading. This is written by Max Kutz. Max was the minister of a UU church in Canton, New York, which is way upstate. When love is felt or fear is known, when holidays or holy days and such times come and go, when anniversaries arrive by calendar or consciousness, when seasons come as seasons do, old and known, but somehow new, when lives are born or people die, when something sacred's sensed in soil or sky, mark the time. Respond with thought or prayer or smile or grief. Let nothing living slip between the fingers of the mind, for all of these are holy things we will not, cannot find again. We're going to do another hymn. This is number 34 in Singing the Living Tradition. And the text for this one is one that I'm sure you know. You know the tune as well. The text is from a book of the New Testament of the Bible, 1 Corinthians 13. It's used at a lot of weddings. So I'm going to ask Nell to play the whole thing, and then when you're ready and able, to stand and sing it. The last week of June, my eldest daughter, Mary, and I took part in the UUA's General Assembly via the internet. Mary, who is the Director of Religious Exploration for a UU congregation in Southern California, joined me here in Maine. By the way, they have canceled church today. She grew up here in UUCB, so we had lots of memories to share. She had never seen this building, so she was really eager to get in here, and she recognized the windows and the Bible and even the piano, which was in the old building, and got saved. As you probably know, one of the major undertakings of this year's General Assembly was hearing and voting on proposed amendments for an updated version of our UU bylaws. Article 2 encompasses our principles and expands on some of the language. But if you know anything about UUs, you know that we really love to work with words. And while aiming for the perfect, we sometimes miss the perfectly good. Several of the proposed amendments were actually voted for further consideration, but I think they started off by accepting almost 100 suggestions and winnowed it down to the number that could be discussed online. It was very interesting. And after further consideration of the entire Article 2, it was then voted that we would consider it for another year. So it is not a done deal yet. But there's a logo coming out, designed around the word love. The commission entrusted the work of updating our bylaws, developed a concept that our core values revolve around love. I have a hunch you'll be hearing a lot more about this during the year from Karma. Well, seeing as how it was suggested that our summer services take the UU principles as their theme, I'm going to take on love, a personal perspective. It begins just after Christmas, the marketing of love. You know, the heart-shaped candy boxes and the cards and the flowers, everything red and white, and the implication that if you don't have someone special in your life who loves you, there might be something wrong with you, or at the very least, you might be missing out. Well, those of us who have been around for a while have learned that it isn't all that clear-cut. This love business is mighty complicated, emotionally messy, and simply splendid. All of those qualities, all at the same time, and writers, poets, musicians, and artists for millennia have found ways to express the delights and perils of love. I can only share with you a few of my own experiences with some quotes and thoughts from others tucked in. To start, those of you who know me probably think that a love of music would be high on my list, and you would be right. But even in the realm of music, there are complications. My mother was a violinist, a violin teacher, and she tried very hard to teach me to play the violin, but it just didn't work. Where I should have gotten the vibrato, I got wrist cramps, which is more up here than here. It didn't work for any of my younger siblings either. But I loved playing the piano, and practicing within earshot of my mother, however, meant she would shout out when she heard a wrong note, and she would hear them all. Well, how can you learn something new without making a few mistakes? And so I never did become as skilled at sight reading as I wanted to be because I was too afraid to make the mistakes. But when I went to college, I decided to take up the organ. All the wrong notes were mine, and they were very loud. My love of music remains. As I become less active and more listening to others' music than trying to make it by myself, I am so grateful for the technology that brings wonderful music right into my home. Especially during the isolation of the pandemic, I learned the value of subscribing to groups like the Berlin Philharmonic, Voces 8, the Netherlands Bach Society. I can virtually attend a state-of-the-art performance of a Bach Brandenburg concerto by just being connected to the internet. I mean, that's just miraculous. Now, for many of us, there is a deep love of nature. And when I return to Maine from a winter in Southern California with my daughters, I seek out the showy lady slippers, those temperamental and temporary harbingers of springtime in Maine. But the ticks are abundant alongside the wildflowers, and the brown-tail caterpillars pose an itchy threat that stops some of my spring saunters. The great outdoors in Maine, as in California, can be delightful, but fraught with risks. I remember how lost I was when I first began spending time on the West Coast. Here in Maine, I knew the names of the weeds, the trees, the mountains. The ocean was east of me, where it had always been and where it belonged. But on the left coast, I felt as if I was on another planet. So much to learn, and the ocean was west of me, and the mountains east. Profoundly confusing. And the always present wildfire threats, those hot winds coming in from the desert, and the constantly eroding sandstone coastline. We have granite, they have sandstone. To be a responsible citizen of this earth, to know and love one's surroundings, we have to find the ways to balance the utterly destructive power of nature with the utterly amazing beauty. The first people who inhabited these lands prior to my European ancestors knew how to live with respect for both the beauty and the destructiveness of the natural world. If I say I love nature, I must walk a path in balance with it. There is an anonymous phrase in Spanish, donde hay amor hay dolor, where there is love, there is sadness. And the poet Rilke says, close your eyes, fall in love, stay there. Would that it were that simple. It is now going on 10 years since my husband John died of cancer. I fought like crazy to change the outcome, but it was finally clear to us. We were able to talk about the fact that he was dying. My role was to carry out his wishes, to make sure he was able to die where and with the people he chose to be around him. John asked me if I would be all right. I couldn't answer that at first. Eventually I said, yes, I will work to be all right. And at the time, I just had no idea what kind of self-love would be required for me to learn to be all right, to be alone but not lonely, well, sort of. Sure, I had lots of support from my family and from dear friends, but when it came right down to the nitty-gritty, I had to love myself enough to get out of bed when I didn't feel like ever getting up again. I think some of you know what that feels like. John had wanted to go to New Zealand. He really wanted to go to New Zealand, but that didn't happen. Now I needed to do it. An awfully long trip, carrying his spirit with me. This, as I see it, is a continuance of love, an honoring of the love that John and I shared. Of course, there is sadness, because he is no longer here, and I would so like it to be otherwise. But there's also gratitude. I'm immensely grateful for the 32 years that John and I shared, even though that gratitude sometimes makes my eyes water. It's like exercise. You have to work at it. It's hard, but it's really important. Several months ago, during a wet California winter, I went to see a film, A Man Called Otto. Any of you seen it? Mm-hmm. Tom Hanks. The trailers looked to me like a feel-good movie, something to cheer me during yet another rainy, wet afternoon. Well, it was lots more. There is some endearing comedy in A Man Called Otto, though it had me and several other folks who were making their way from the theater wiping tears. It is a story about a grumpy old man who has lots of really good reasons to be grumpy and doesn't want to keep dealing with the rest of his life. Then along comes a neighbor and her chaotic family, her persistently friendly attitude, and we're engaged in a story of community love. Oh, and there's a persistently affectionate stray cat, too. It is an inspiring story, a love story, complicated, messy, and yet wonderful. There are times when complicated and messy aspects of love seem to win out. Love becomes something unromantic, ugly, determined, and in spite of. We may find ourselves caring for a beloved partner, doing what once seemed impossible, fiercely holding to love in a terribly challenging form. When John and I knew that his cancer was terminal, he told me he wanted to return to California to be with his elder sister, a gifted retired nurse. So with the help of our adult son, we made the arrangements to shift our hospice care from Brunswick, Maine to Temecula, California. At that point, John could no longer walk or even stand. Our journey across the country was epic, requiring the help of many and the strong kindness of friends, some right here in this congregation, and some who were strangers. When we finally arrived, we sadly realized that his sister Anne, with whom John had helped several of their elders through death, could only put her stethoscope around her neck, but no longer remembered her nursing skills, even for her beloved brother. It didn't take long for me to have a meltdown. Our then 31-year-old son lovingly gathered me and suggested we hire full-time help. Hiring a full-time, end-of-life nurse turned out to be an act of love for him, for me, for the family that was around us. And I shall forever be grateful to our son, Will, who, while grieving the imminent loss of his father, had the wisdom and compassion to urge me to make that decision. Oh, there are so many ways of love, from the joy of discovery, the commitment of lifelong partnership, all the way to death, to the seemingly superficial loving kindness from or toward a complete stranger, a momentary gesture that just might be the high point of someone's day. The afternoon that I went up to Oceanside to see a man called Otto, it was pouring buckets when the movie was done. I headed first for the restroom, and as I finished drying my hands and putting on my bright yellow LL Bean rain jacket, I pulled out my train schedule. A woman who was standing a little ways away came over and she said, how far are you traveling? I said, I live in Encinitas. She said, so do we. She said, my husband and I drove up here with another friend, and we're about to drive back. Would you like to have a ride? As my daughters will tell you, I'm fiercely determined to use public transportation where available. But looking at the conditions, even though I was as prepared as I could be, I knew this was an offer I wanted to accept. Indeed, these folks had a spacious four-seater truck. We exchanged names. I learned that they were living within walking distance of me, and her brother had been my high school granddaughter's welding teacher. Now, I suppose accepting a ride from someone you meet in a public restroom is a bit risky. That thought did cross my mind, but gut feelings came into play, and it was, as we'd say here in Maine, a wicked smart decision. Well, a ride home on a rainy afternoon certainly doesn't constitute a love relationship, but it might be a metaphor for trusting. For me, that stormy afternoon, I made some new friends and arrived home nearly dry and grinning with gratitude. So I ask, is there any kind of love that isn't risky? That doesn't involve trust? That doesn't open us to vulnerability? probably some pretty hard work, and even grief. We can protect ourselves from these risks by turning down all the possibilities. But that is where we hope we have lived long enough to be making wise decisions. One more story. Just before COVID, my daughter Mary and I took a Rhodes Scholar trip to the Amazon River. We flew into the city of Manaus, Brazil, population 2 million, on the north shore of the Amazon River, 1,000 miles west of the Atlantic Ocean. Yeah, 1,000 miles west of the Atlantic Ocean. And it's a major seaport. The shipping container ships come all the way in from the Atlantic to Manaus. We had some time before we boarded our riverboat to walk around the city, and like any city, it's beautiful and ugly. And the language there is Portuguese, not Spanish, Portuguese, which is related but really different. So Mary and I, obviously tourists, were standing at a crosswalk waiting for the light to change, and this young adult man came up to us making the sign of love, and we could understand enough of his language. He was saying, "Thank you for visiting my country. Thank you so much for visiting my country." I'm thinking, we could do that here with tourists in Brunswick. You know, thank you for visiting our town, our state. Just a brief encounter with a stranger, but a loving moment, and one that has continued to last with me. Thank you for your attention.
Now is the time in our service that we're going to take up the offering. The charity for soul this month is Habitat for Humanity. 50% of the collection goes to the church and 50% goes to Habitat. Please give generously.
So now I'm going to throw one at you that I'm pretty sure none of you has ever sung before. It's number 359 in Singing the Living Tradition. And it's one of those tunes that the UUA sent to me and said, this is a great old tune. In fact, the composer, Charles Hubert Hastings Perry, you can tell that's a British name, died in 1918. So this really is an old British tune. They said it needs a new text. And lo and behold, they accepted the text that I submitted. So I'm a little attached to this text. And I'm going to ask Nell to play the whole thing through so you get to hear the tune. Very British walking tune. Seated. Good effort. Thank you, Nell. My closing words are from a poem by Ted Kooser. Some of you may know who he is. I didn't know who he was. I just knew that he was born in the same year I was born, 1939. And I saw this poem on a poster on the number 7 subway in New York City and took a picture of it. Said, that's a poem I have to learn and I have to share. It's called A Map of the World. Oops. One of the ancient maps of the world is heart-shaped, carefully drawn, and once washed with bright colors, though the colors have faded, as you might expect feelings to fade from a fragile old heart, the brown map of a life. But feeling is indelible, and longing infinite. A starburst compass pointing in all directions two lovers might go, a fresh breeze swelling their sails. The future uncharted, still far from the edge where the sea pours into the stars. I invite you to greet your neighbor.
What a beautiful poem that was.
Isn't that gorgeous?
Yeah.